In 1985, Marty McFly gets into a flying DeLorean. And a few moments later, he lands in his own hood, Hill Valley, but it's 30 years later. So Marty gets out of the DeLorean, he opens up those crazy doors, he walks outside. He begins to walk around the neighborhood that he's lived in his entire life, the neighborhood that his father was born and raised in, the neighborhood his grandfather was born and raised in. And he sees it's still his neighborhood, it's still called Hill Valley, but literally nothing else is the same. The Assembly of Christ Church has become the Hill Valley Museum of Art. Lou's Aerobic Fitness Center has become Cafe 80s, where instead of real-life waiters, they have Ronald Reagan and Michael Jackson on video taking your order. Skateboards have become hoverboards. The newspaper says that Chicago Cubs have somehow become world champions. And every few steps, Marty has to stop and turn around because he can't believe how the person next to him is dressed. And Back to the Future 2, all of this is intended to be humorous. In real life, it's horrifying. And yet this is essentially, in a much less comedic degree, what happens with gentrification. People with generations of history, generations of community, generations of experiences in a neighborhood no longer recognize their own neighborhood. And much like for Marty and the DeLorean, it seems to happen in the blink of an eye, just instantaneously. We're going to talk about gentrification today. Let's define our terms. Gentrification, the term was invented by a sociologist, a British sociologist named Ruth Glass in 1964. Ruth Glass coined this fancy sociological term because she had to. Because she was watching something happen in the working class neighborhoods of London, England, that she could not describe with any existing word. She had to describe what she was seeing. So she came up with this word, gentrification. And what she was seeing, and what the word essentially means, is this: the transmutation of a neighborhood that comes when wealthy residents move in, and their presence and their dollars force the prior existing residents who have a lower income out of the same neighborhood. The transmutation of a neighborhood that comes when wealthy residents move into a neighborhood and their presence and their dollars force out the lower income existing residents. But this is America. And in America, wealth significantly correlates with race. So for our purposes today, I'm going to define it a little more specifically in America. In America, gentrification generally looks like this: the intentional, systemic whitening of a previously black or brown neighborhood. The intentional, systemic whitening of a previously black or brown neighborhood. And this intentional, systemic whitening of a previously black or brown neighborhood has happened in some of the most culturally rich and historical neighborhoods in all of our country. It's happened in Harlem, it's happened in Brooklyn, it's happened in parts of Chicago, it's happened in parts of Boston, it's happening right here where I'm speaking in my home city of Portland, Oregon. If you live in the United States of America, in a city or near a city, it is probably safe to say that it has happened or is happening right outside of your front door. It is not a coincidence that this rush to gentrification, this peak of gentrification, is happening at the exact same time that the evangelical church has taken a very intense interest in cities. It's happened, not coincidentally, I think, at the same time that we have said we need to love our cities, and we've begun planting churches, attending churches, and building churches in the inner city. Maybe you're familiar with that recent emphasis over the past 15 to 20 years in evangelicalism. We need to love our city, be present in our city. That is a valuable and valid point. The problem is that when we as Christians, and especially we as white Christians, try to love our city without seriously and sincerely taking into account gentrification, we will both fail to love our city and fail to love our neighbor. We will both fail to love our city and fail to love our neighbor if we dare mess in the city without first taking gentrification into account. This has exceedingly important implications for white evangelicals like me. This has exceedingly important implications for black and brown evangelicals like many of you. We're going to talk about what those implications are today. But before we do that, before we get to what Scripture says, before we answer the, okay, but what am I supposed to do about it question, which we have to answer, we need to understand the history of gentrification and the present, very real, effects of gentrification. So let's start with the history. Rewind back to World War II. It's just ended. And as World War II ended, two things happened simultaneously. Number one, there was an economic boom that caused a great increase in manufacturing jobs in inner cities. At the same time, the GI Bill was introduced. This bill allowed for white service members returning to be able to receive absurdly low mortgage rates that would allow them and their families to become homeowners. With these two things happening simultaneously, you had a number of immigrants and African Americans moving in to the inner cities because that's where the new blue-collar jobs were. So you saw a change in the population of the city. You also saw at the same time white families moving out of the cities to intentionally all-white paradises that they created called suburbs. The historical phrase to describe this is white flight, and it's an accurate one. What we rarely talk about, though, is that not only did white families flee from the cities to the suburbs, but white churches fled right along with them. By 1979, the mainline Presbyterians were closing 2 churches in the city for every 1 church they were opening in the suburbs. By 1987, only 18% of self-identified evangelicals lived within the city limits. 18%. The church had fled, the families had fled. Now, as a result of this white flight of both families and churches, property value in cities plummeted. Property value in the suburbs skyrocketed. This is because in America, the value of a piece of property has a lot less to do with the property itself than it does with where that piece of land is located. Or maybe more accurately to say, or equally accurate to say, it has more to do with who is located near that land. The famous real estate mantra of location, location, location could also be translated as race, race, race. During the same time that white families and churches were abandoning the inner cities, there were minority families and minority churches investing in the inner cities. Social services were started, businesses were established, neighborhoods were formed, school communities and religious communities were launched, relational bonds were forged, and the gospel of Jesus Christ was faithfully preached. But at the same time that all of this was going on in the suburbs and all of this was going on in the cities, the American economy, which had created this situation in the first place, was changing. It was changing from a manufacturing or industrial-centered economy to a service or information-centered economy. And suddenly, the very cities that businesses and families and churches had abandoned became attractive because people began to realize that the city was the central hub from which information could be shared and from which services could be provided to all these surrounding suburbs and everyone inside the city. They were a central location. The government saw this, and so the government began to invest, even to the degree of subsidizing white businesses and young white professionals who are willing to come into the city and open businesses and serve in, quote, bad neighborhoods, because as the government had decided, quote, the investments were too risky for the private sector. In other words, banks wouldn't put money into black and brown communities. So we'll give money to white people who will come into black and brown communities because we see the city is changing. At the exact same time, white families in the suburbs were beginning to realize that the paradise they had created wasn't all that convenient. The architecture was not of the same quality nor of the same beauty as the architecture of the city. Their location was not centrally located. In fact, it was incredibly inconvenient. They had to spend hours in the car going to work or running errands or whatever else they had to do because they didn't live in a city center. The gas prices were rising beyond what they ever thought gas would cost. And somehow, the very unique and attractive cultures that existed in the cities, suburbs were never able to reproduce that. Suburbs were never able to create a suburban culture in the sense, certainly there is a suburban culture, but not in the sense of a unique and attractive cultural identity that made people want to be a part of it. City governments were aware of this, and they saw an opportunity to make lots and lots of money. If they could get more wealthy people, more white people, to move into the city center, into the, quote, inner city, that would bring them an increase in property taxes, an increase in sales tax, an increase in tourism dollars, an increase in all sorts of money. So the city decided that they would begin to work with banks, with developers, with businesses to systematically transform the inner city to become a money-making center. The term that's used to describe this process is urban renewal, which is a euphemism for gentrification, the intentional, systemic whitening of a previously black or brown neighborhood. And that process of utterly transforming entire cities all across our country was much, much easier than it sounds, and much, much quicker than you might think. We talked earlier about this interplay between race and property value, and quickly that came into play again. Because of the low property value and racial makeup, which were related in the inner cities, banks had denied loans to businesses there, particularly minority businesses, to minority churches, to minority individuals in the inner city for decades. Police resources, city police resources, had been either misdirected or incredibly limited. Public schools in the inner cities were left for dead. Cleaning and fixing city property, those of us who have lived in Portland any length of time can testify to this, was not a priority. The result is that there was all sorts of property available in the inner city for very, 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 very little money. And all of that property would have remained as it was, untouched, uncared for, if it weren't for the city's open commitment to urban renewal and the banks and developers being aware of said commitment. That gave developers the confidence to go and buy up what they could buy up at these ridiculously low prices, and it gave banks the confidence to begin loaning more money and more money and more money, not to the people who they had denied loans to for decades, but to new people from the suburbs, wealthy people, white people, who were willing to start new businesses in, again, what they had perceived to be a bad neighborhood. And the city rewarded the banks, and the city rewarded the developers by beginning to police the streets, by beginning to clean the streets, by beginning to improve the streets that they had virtually ignored for a generation to two or three. And what happened? Well, the more that banks invested, and the more that developers invested, and the more that the city invested, the more attractive the inner city became to white suburbanites. As more white suburbanites began to relocate to the now attractive city, more businesses were started to serve the new white cultural tastes and white population. As those businesses were started to serve the taste of this new community, more white people were drawn in, out of the suburbs, into the inner city. And because property value is tied to race in the United States, the more white people and white businesses that came into the inner city, the more the property value and prices rose and rose and rose. Property price, rent, property taxes, everything just went up and up and up, which meant that those who had a lower income, those who were living in this neighborhood partially because of the price of this neighborhood, could never live in the neighborhood again. Black and brown people were literally displaced from their own neighborhood, the neighborhood that they had called home for generations, the neighborhood that they had shaped with their own hands, the neighborhood that they had imprinted with their culture and with their values, the neighborhood that started their churches, their businesses, their services. They were displaced from their homes, they were displaced from their communities, and they were forced to scatter to any one of these surrounding suburbs, the very suburbs from which the people who had created them to be a paradise just found wanting and left. Obviously, so much more could be said about the history of gentrification, but for our purposes today, that's where we're going to stop with the history piece. It's sufficient. We're going to talk about the effects of it, we're going to talk about the biblical data of that, but before we do that, we need to clarify one thing that at this point maybe isn't all that clear. Gentrification is, in this country, systemic racism. But gentrifiers are not necessarily racist. Gentrification in this country is systemic racism, but gentrifiers are not necessarily racist. Many who are moving into the inner cities are decidedly anti-racist. Let me explain. Gentrification is systemic in that it preserves our country's history of white supremacy and inequitable outcomes across racial lines. Just like other systems, though, this system can produce racialized results without a single racist person within the system, which to me is even more horrifying than the alternative. The truth is that so many moving into these cities, so many who are producing these effects, which are certainly across racial lines and prove to be racist, have no desire whatsoever to see their shopping habits or their choice of address produce racist effects. But here's the thing. As long as they're moving into the city because it's a neighborhood created for them, it will produce racist effects. It will. So intentionally or not, whether the people involved, the people like me who live in the cities or people who are moving into the cities intend for racist results or not, the very existence of this system produces racist results without fail. And the effects of it are real, and the effects of it fall inequitably across racial lines. Because of that, we need to talk about those effects. We need to all be aware of what this system is producing in our new neighborhoods or our old neighborhoods. Because intended or not, the racialized effects of gentrification are very, very real. I'm going to talk about effects in several different categories. I'm going to talk about the practical effects, I'm going to talk about the emotional effects, and I'm going to talk about the spiritual effects. Now, of course, as with any categorization like that, they all overlap, right? But we're going to break it into those sections to be helpful for me to understand what I'm saying and hopefully for you to remember. It doesn't mean that we're going to cover every effect. I'm just going to share effects that are common in all the cities where this is happening. The first practical effect is this. Unlike gentrifiers who move into a new city, the black and brown people they displace in general, do not have the power to choose where they get to live. It's generally chosen for them based on two factors. Where the city chooses to invest, they don't get to live there. And where white people want to live, they generally don't get to live there. Even if that means that they'll be uprooted from the only community that they, their parents, or their grandparents have ever known. To illustrate this, I want to quote a great philosopher by the name of Chris Rock. I know every single Chris Rock bit ever done by heart, but I'm going to have to paraphrase this one a little bit. And it might be the only non-controversial thing I say today because it's him saying it. I will be speaking as Chris Rock. Otherwise, this ain't going to make any sense, all right? In my neighborhood, wait, let me say this also. It's not going to be funny when I say it, so don't expect it to be funny. Go home and YouTube it, and it will be hilarious. Right now, the point is not whether or not it's funny, the point is that it's insightful. In my neighborhood, there are 4 black people. Hundreds of houses, 4 black people. Who are these black people? Well, there's me. I'm a decent comedian. I'm all right. There's Mary J. Blige, the greatest R&B singer to ever walk the earth. There's Jay-Z, one of the greatest rappers to ever live. There's Eddie Murphy, one of the greatest comedic actors to ever do it. Do you know what the white man who lives next door to me does for a living? He's a dentist. He ain't the best dentist in the world. He ain't going to the Dental Hall of Fame. He ain't got plaques for getting rid of plaque. He's just a normal yank your tooth out dentist. Do you know what a black dentist would have to do to move into my neighborhood? He'd have to invent teeth. If you, like me, are white, if you, like me, are even close to middle class, I want you to think about that. Do you take for granted the inherited power that you have to live in any one of dozens of neighborhoods that you may desire to live in? Do you take for granted that the power that you have to always, and I mean always, live in a neighborhood where there are people who look like you, people who see the world like you, and services and businesses designed to serve you? Well, if you take that for granted, you need to understand that's not a reality that can be taken for granted by many of your brothers and sisters. Which leads to the second practical effect that I want to cover with you today, and that is simply limited access to culturally appropriate services. Limited access to culturally appropriate services. As minorities are displaced, they're separated from the businesses, services, the churches, all these things that existed in this neighborhood to specifically serve them, their community, their values, their tastes. Food, salons, hair supply, art, and of course, worst of all, churches. Many times, those who are displaced can be separated not just from things that were designed to serve their culture, they can be separated from any semblance of their culture altogether. There no longer is a black community. There no longer is a Latino community. Everyone's been separated and scattered to different parts of these suburbs and these newly created suburbs that used to be just nothingness. As a white American, I literally will never, ever, ever have to worry about not being able to find my culture reflected anywhere I live. I will never have to worry about there not being businesses or services designed to serve me. As white Americans, that's an effect that we can't even fathom. And yet it happens to many of our brothers and sisters every single day. A third practical effect is education. As minority families are displaced and relocated, the children are forced to attend schools that have been homogeneous by design from the very first day they existed. This means that these schools are filled with teachers and administrators who do not in any way understand the identity, the values, the learning styles of the new population that they're being called to serve, nor do they understand, because they've never had to deal with it, how to handle the difficulties that arise when a historically homogeneous institution becomes suddenly diversified. White parents of white children will never, ever, ever have to worry about that. Not only are your values and learning styles and experiences understood in whatever school context you find yourself in, they are, to be honest, catered to on a silver platter. A fourth practical effect of gentrification is commodification. The commodification of a neighborhood culture that was created by the pre-gentrification community. Those coming into the new community decide to co-opt that previously existing culture and profit off of that previously existing culture, without any connection to the culture itself. So I can only speak for myself. In my neighborhood in Portland, here's some of the things that have happened. Soul food restaurants have been started by white hipsters. And there is literally not a single person or reflection of the old neighborhood in the entire facility, not one. Mexican restaurants have been started by white hipsters. And the only brown faces in the entire building are where? In the kitchen. Burger spot after burger spot, coffee house after coffee house is started, and they play 90s R&B, right, and 90s hip-hop. They got pictures of Miles Davis on the wall and Tupac on the wall. Well, their white customers pay ridiculous amounts of money to enjoy a whitewashed version of the very black culture they just displaced. The commodification of the culture. We don't want you here, but we will gladly adopt your culture and profit off it. As you can imagine, practical effects like these don't come by themselves. They come with emotional consequences as well, and they are heavy. If you're not personally affected by this, I want to say the best way for you to really understand the emotional consequences that go into this is to ask somebody who's been affected by it. I am not the spokesperson for the effects of gentrification. Talk to people who have personally been impacted by it. But I am the one with the microphone today, and so what I will do is not tell you what I think, I will tell you what people have told me when I've asked this question. So I'm not really speaking, I'm the microphone through which they are speaking. One common answer that I hear constantly is this: I no longer feel welcome in my own neighborhood. Once gentrification reaches that midway point where as many people have moved in as have been displaced, suddenly those who were there for generations no longer look like they fit in their own neighborhood. And far more often than you and I might think, the new residents make that known. Sometimes they make it known by just not serving the black and brown faces in their businesses or serving them differently. Sometimes they make it known by following the black and brown faces down every single aisle in their business out of fear that somehow they're going to damage their store or steal from them. Sometimes they make it known through a simple, unwelcoming stare. Sometimes they make it known by being unwilling to greet one who greets them. And sometimes they make it known by just flat out saying, "You're not welcome here." A friend of mine had this experience not long ago at all, just a few weeks ago. He and his family have lived in the same house for his 40-plus years of life. 15 years ago, every single house on both sides of that block were occupied by African-American families. Today, every single house on both sides of that block is occupied by someone who looks like me, with the one exception being the house that he and his family have lived in for over 40 years. So one night, he's coming home in his car, and he parks his car on the same street he's parked it his whole life, outside of the same house he's parked it outside of his whole life. And like many of us, before he walks into the house, he wants to decompress a bit, so he sits in the car for a second. And as he's sitting in the car, a white man comes out of his house, a new resident in the neighborhood, comes up to this man at his car and says to him, "Can you please not park here anymore? We've noticed you parking here several times, and it's really creepy. It's making my girlfriend uncomfortable." And of course, he said nothing. Like, what would you say? He was so overwhelmed with the emotion of not being welcomed on the block he had lived on for 40-plus years that he was speechless. The first emotional effect is I no longer feel welcome in my own neighborhood. The second emotional effect is I feel unsafe. See, the very people who think that a certain type of person no longer belongs in the city happen to be people of power. They didn't necessarily ask for that power. It's the way our society functions. And because they're people of power, they can use their power against the residents of old who don't have the same power distributed to them by our society, and even worse, no longer have their own community there to protect them. And so a family in our church had some really scary experiences as a result with their black teenage boys. Their black teenage boys were regularly pulled over 2 blocks from their home, regularly. They weren't violating any traffic violations, they just didn't look like they belonged anymore. They also weren't breaking any laws when they, as teenage boys, would be followed home as they walked from their high school to their home by squad cars, following them, following them, following them. They also hadn't broken any laws when, as they tried to walk up the steps to their own house, they were confronted by an angry officer wielding a weapon. Not because they didn't belong there, it was their house and they were returning from Bible study, but because they didn't look anymore like they belonged. And as a result of not fitting, their safety was constantly under threat. A third emotional effect that you might hear if you ask this question is this: I don't know where my community is anymore. Imagine that. Like the community that you fit in for generations, the only community you've ever known, that your family has ever known, you no longer fit in. The community that used to be there, and it was a community, it's gone. The community that's come in is not designed to serve you. It's not designed to welcome you, and at times it's not even designed to acknowledge your existence. The community you've been forced to relocate to isn't a community either. People who look like you have not all moved to the same place. They've been scattered all over the city limits. You may be the only Latino or the only African American in your new community, but even if you're one of many, there's still no signs of your culture and your presence and things designed to serve you like there used to be. None of the stores, none of the restaurants, none of the schools, none of the social services, none of the churches. You are an alien in a foreign land. Except unlike E.T., you can't go home again, because home doesn't exist anymore. That's heavy, heavy emotional consequences that if we really want to love the city, we cannot ignore. But the consequences don't end there. There are spiritual consequences as well. One of those spiritual consequences is that after gentrification, it is often true that black and brown people no longer have the option of attending a neighborhood church. Well, they could commute 20, 40, 120 minutes to their old church in their old neighborhood where they can no longer afford to live. But the problem is those churches are either dead or dying, because when everybody has to communicate that far to get to church, people stop coming to church. Well, they could attend one of the churches in the new neighborhood that they've been displaced to or relocated to. Yes, absolutely. The problem is that those churches are not accustomed to there being anybody in their surrounding population who is not like them. And so there is a minute number of them who even have the slightest degree of cultural competency or cultural concern to care to try to love and serve their new neighbors in a way that actually takes into account their culture. Of course, most would say, we want to love them, but very, 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 very few have any idea how. And so, yeah, you could go there, but as one of the very few people of color, if not the only person of color in the church, you will be forced to pay the cost, not them. You will pay the cost of having to adapt white cultural forms of preaching, white cultural forms of worship, white cultural forms of community, white cultural forms of small groups. Well, there is a third option, right? The third option is, aren't there some new multi-ethnic or black churches being started out in these far distant lands precisely because of this? Yes, amen. Thank God there are. The problem is, because everyone's been scattered to 1,000 different places, yes, you can come on Sunday and you can have a culturally sensitive worship service, but the community life, It's not what it used to be. It used to be that everybody lived in the same place and went to the church in that neighborhood, and now there is no community. We're scattered everywhere. And so, yes, I can have a great worship service on Sunday, but what about after Sunday? A second spiritual effect is that as neighborhood churches decline, and they're declining in the old neighborhood for the reasons we just said, church participation declines. As neighborhood churches decline, church participation declines for the exact same reason. Longer distance, longer travel. What we often don't take into account is that one of the reasons the city is so convenient is because of the wonderful public transportation systems that tend to exist within it. Well, when you're displaced from the city, you are generally placed in areas that either don't have any public transportation services or have incredibly inconvenient public transportation services. So what used to be a quick bus ride away is now I can't even get there on a bus away. There's also the cost of time. Okay, if I'm going to commute all the way to the neighborhood church, that's going to take half my day. I don't have half my day. There's also the cost of money. It's not a coincidence that the people who are being displaced are those who have historically less financial resources. So it isn't just oh, no problem, I can drive 45 minutes every weekend to church. That's not as easy as it may sound to some of you who may do it regularly. As physical distance grows greater between member and member in church, consistency grows weaker. As physical distance grows greater, social connections grow weaker. And one of the reasons we keep going to church is the social connections. If you kill the social connections, you kill a huge piece of the motivation and the willingness to pay a cost to go to church. Third spiritual effect is that as church participation declines, Christian discipleship is hindered. It is made clear over and over and over again in the Scriptures that discipleship happens where? In the context of community. God didn't design discipleship to be a random thing that just happened. He designed a lab in which it is supposed to happen. Christian community, local church. But if you find yourself unable or unwilling to attend church or find yourself unable to connect with its members because of the huge distance that's been created, discipleship suffers. You can't even obey as a Christian at least 7 books of the New Testament. Like you can't obey any commands in them, in Ephesians, in Colossians, in 1 Timothy, in 2 Timothy, in Titus. Unless you're a part of a local church, you literally can't obey a significant portion of the New Testament. And if gentrification has made it so you can't be a part of a local church, gentrification made it so you can't obey the Bible, you can't be a disciple, and you can't make disciples. In other words, gentrification is not just a political injustice, it's not just an economic injustice, it's not just a social injustice, it very seriously is a spiritual injustice. Fourth and finally, as we're talking about spiritual consequences, the more that minority Christians feel disconnected from the communities they live in and the communities they worship in, the more evangelism suffers. This is another thing that Jesus says comes from community into a community. If you don't have a community to come from or a community to go in, what happens to evangelism? Jesus says in John 17, as he's praying to the Father, that the gospel will be believable and attractive to outsiders because of our unity. What happens to the unity after gentrification? 1 Peter in chapter 2 says that it is our visible unity that declares the praises of Christ. What if there's no visible unity? Gentrification hinders evangelism. All right, guys, to this point, we've reviewed some history. And to this point, we've looked at some practical effects, some emotional effects, some spiritual effects. And you're probably as depressed as I am right now, right? So the question then becomes, what do I do about it? Like, none of us are happy to hear that. What do I do about it? What does the Bible say about it? I'm glad you asked. We're going to talk about that, but we're going to do that in 2 categories. And again, I'm putting myself in a position that's not all that convenient, but it's necessary. So first, we will talk about what the Bible says to white evangelicals who are moving into cities, planting churches in cities, attending churches in cities. What does the Bible say to those of us who would fit into that category, who don't want to see these effects but are wrapped up in this system? Secondly, we'll look at what does the Bible say to black and brown Christians who are being displaced, have been displaced, or have watched their loved ones be displaced. What does God have to say to all of us in this mix? We'll start with the white folk, because they're my people and I can speak to them. As white evangelicals have talked about our call to love the city, we have over and over and over again based that call on a very specific passage, a wonderful passage, Jeremiah chapter 29, verses 4 through 7. Let me read to you the words of God through his prophet Jeremiah to the people of Israel. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, the city, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. All right. It's an incredibly powerful passage from prophet Jeremiah that instructs us, as we read it, to love and serve the city by praying for it, by seeking its good, and by making our home there. But as beautiful as that passage is, there are two, I think, massive problems with white evangelicals like me using this passage as our justification and our guide in loving the city. The first problem is this, the passage itself. As wonderful as the passage is, my fellow white evangelicals, this passage is not for you. This passage, as is very clear from the context, is supposed to be applied to the black and brown people who are being displaced. That's the context of Jeremiah 29. God is speaking to his people, to Israel. In a context. What is the context? They were conquered by a people more powerful than them. They were displaced from their homes. They were separated from their families. They were disconnected from their places of worship. And they were landed in a new place that they didn't ask to be in. And God says to them, as victims displaced by a more powerful group, he says to them, in spite of what this city did to you, in spite of how they treated you like a commodity, in spite of how they robbed you from everything that was home, love them. In spite of it, seek their good. In spite of it, pray for them. That's a really powerful thing. But it ain't for us. This passage in that way, isn't intended to be applied to white evangelicals, which means we need a passage that speaks to us, the displacers, and not the displaced. And I'll propose one in just a minute. But first, let me tell you the second problem that I think we should have with white evangelicals like me using Jeremiah 29 to justify our loving the city in the way that we have loved it. And that problem has to do with when and why we started quoting Jeremiah 29. It is a historical fact that white evangelicals were not telling us to love and serve the city in this way when the city was predominantly populated by minorities. We were fleeing it. It's a historical fact. We were fleeing it. We were content with having our black and brown brothers and sisters be the only surviving witness in the inner cities we abandoned. We were content with generally doing nothing to come alongside them or occasionally throwing a few dollars to feed a few people. We didn't seek the peace and prosperity of the city. We did the exact opposite. We fled from it and created our own peace, our own prosperity in a new paradise and completely abandoned the city. So then when did we start wanting to plant churches in the city? When did we start wanting to attend churches in the city? When did we all start wanting to move into the city? Let's be honest. We started wanting to do that when the city became white. When the culture changed to our tastes. When the city became convenient for us, that's when we started sounding the alarm to love the city and serve the city and move into the city and abandon the suburban paradise. That's when we started it. That troubles me. It is troubling, isn't it? Like the first thing that we should do, I'm talking as a white evangelical to fellow white evangelicals. The first thing that we should do is self-evaluate. Just sincerely. And there's no wrong answer here because the right answer is the truth. So the question that we should be asking is, do I really love the city? I mean, do I love the whole city? Is that why I'm planting there? Is that why I'm moving there? Is that why I'm attending church there? Or is part of this motivation really a love for myself? That I'm planting or I'm moving in or I'm attending church in the city because the city's attractive to me now. Because the city's hip and sexy now. Because the city's convenient for me now. Because the city reflects my culture now. Because the city's safe now. Because the city's profitable for now. Like, why really am I so passionate about this city? And what does it say about me? And what does it say about my white evangelical brothers and sisters that we absolutely ignored it when it wasn't built for us? Which leads us to the passage I think should guide white evangelicals in place of Jeremiah 29, Luke 10, 25 through 37, more easily referred to as the parable of the Good Samaritan. In this passage, an expert in the law, a Jewish expert in the law, stands up to test Jesus. And he says, "Teacher, what must I do to inherit eternal life?" "How do you read it? How do you read the law?" Jesus asks. "Well," he responds, "love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your mind, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." It was the right answer. Jesus affirmed it as the right answer, but that wasn't the end of the conversation because, like all of us, the guy wanted to justify himself. So he wanted to narrow down that category of loving the neighbor and ask, okay, great, but who is my neighbor? And he seems to be hoping that Jesus is going to give this answer, that his neighbor is the person who looks like him. His neighbor is the person who lives where he lives. His neighbor is the one of the same social or economic status as him. His neighbor is the one of the same religion as him. That ain't what Jesus says. Jesus responds instead with a story that flips everything the teacher believes upside down, and which ought to do the same to us. It starts with Jesus introducing an innocent victim. A Jewish man who was innocently traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho, and as he was traveling, he was overtaken by robbers, and those robbers stripped him of everything he had, literally, including his clothes. They beat him, they left him covered on the dirt road, ready to die. That's the victim. Jesus introduces a second character, a priest, a Jewish priest. The Jewish priest begins to walk down that same road, and of course, the Jewish audience listening is thinking, oh, cool. All right, we got this. We're going to stop. We're going to help this guy. That's what it means to be a neighbor. I get it. But Jesus says, but the Jewish priest not only kept walking, but intentionally crossed to the other side so that he wouldn't even have to acknowledge the existence of the victim laying in the road. Well, that would have been shocking, but the next thing Jesus does is introduce a new character, and the new character is a Levite. Now, okay, everyday priest might make an error, but the Levite, he's got this. All right, okay, so the Levite's walking down the street, and Jesus says he does the same thing. Not only does he pass by, he steps to the other side, so he doesn't even have to acknowledge the existence of his suffering, and he keeps on moving. And then Jesus says, as the story goes on, okay, he doesn't say this, but I'm going to set the stage, all right? I'm going to set the stage. So your first supposed hero turned out not to be a hero. Your second supposed hero turned out not to be a hero. Let me now introduce a villain into the story. So he introduces a fourth character, the Samaritan. Now, we always say the parable of the Good Samaritan. We have to understand that for the Jew in that time, those two words could never be placed together. Good Samaritan? They're half-breeds. They're traitors against the Jewish religion. They're traitors against God. They're traitor against the nation of Israel. Traitors against the nation of Israel. There's no such thing as a good Samaritan. So, of course, if the Jews didn't stop and help this guy, the Samaritan is probably going to beat him up to death and take whatever he has left on him. But no, the Samaritan doesn't cross to the other side of the street. The Samaritan comes right up to the innocent Jewish victim, puts himself and his own interests at risk to bend down and care for this man. He begins to wipe his wounds. He picks him up. He takes him to the nearest inn. And then to the innkeeper, he says, look, whatever it takes to nurse this man back to health, you do it. And charge me. It's on me. Jesus completely shocks his audience. And then, because he's the greatest teacher of all time, he turns to the Jewish teacher, the expert in the law, And by implication, he turns to us. And he asks, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hand of the robbers? Now, of course, we know what a literal neighbor is, right? The literal neighbors were the two Jewish characters. They lived in Jerusalem with him. They were of the same nationality. They were his literal neighbors, but they didn't behave like neighbors. The one who did behave like a neighbor was one who didn't live on the same block, one who didn't look the same or have the same ethnic heritage, one who didn't have the same religion, one who was completely other. And the Jewish teacher in the law, because a good Samaritan can't exist, can't even bring himself to answer the question by saying, oh, the character you called the Samaritan. He says, the one who had mercy on him. And Jesus simply says to him, and by implication to us, go and do likewise. White evangelicals, I think this is a much better guide for us as we move into the city or live in the city. Because of the history of our country, your whiteness and my whiteness puts us in a position of power. It doesn't matter if you want it, you have it. Our literal neighbors, those who look like us and live near us, share the exact same power. But there are people who, like the Jewish victim in this story, are vulnerable, don't have the same power, through no fault of their own. Through no fault of their own. They are victims to something, a system that is outside of their control. And we, white evangelicals, we have a choice to make as we enter into the city. Will we pass by them and completely ignore them as we make our home in a city that used to be theirs without taking their spiritual, practical, and emotional suffering into account? Or will we have mercy and be neighbors? Whether we live on the same block or not, will we have mercy and be neighbors? If we choose to have mercy, which we're going to do, because that's what Jesus is calling us to do, it will change how we enter the city. We will no longer enter the city, white evangelicals like me, planting churches by white people, of white people, for white people, as if the rest of the neighborhood doesn't exist and never existed. Instead, we will look for ways to connect with the old neighborhood. We will look for ways to learn from the old neighborhood. Maybe that means that we merge with an existing African American or Latino church in the city. Or maybe it means that we just sit at their feet and learn, how can we best serve the neighborhood that was here before we got here? How can we make them feel welcome instead of absolutely ignored? If we choose to have mercy, my white evangelical brothers and sisters, we will have to change how we enter the city. We won't move into historically African American church buildings and transform them into havens for hipsters and then ask African American pastors who have roots in this city to come to our church, pray a prayer of blessing, or otherwise endorse us as if it were the colonized who had to somehow lend more power to the colonizers. If we choose to move into the city and love the city as neighbors, it will change how we enter. We will stop talking about how much the neighborhood has improved without taking into account the cost that so-called improvement had on our real-life brothers and sisters. Instead, we will talk about the cost and we will allow that cost to shape us. If we choose to move into the city loving our neighbors, we won't talk or think as if we're bringing the gospel into the city for the first time, which we as evangelicals often do. We will acknowledge the history of those who stood on that same block and continued to preach the gospel in the face of everything that was there while we fled like cowards. We will change the way we enter the city. We won't promote our vision and our experiences for the city. We'll stop and we'll listen to the vision and the experiences of those who were there decades and generations before we had any interest in stepping our foot in it. My white evangelical brothers and sisters, this is not a guilt trip. It doesn't help you, it doesn't help me, it doesn't help our brothers and sisters. The truth is, the white evangelical church did not cause gentrification. Let's say that. But I have a friend named Ross Halbach who's also a white evangelical like me, and he says this: though we did not cause it, we have socially and theologically legitimized it. Unintentionally, but we've done it. And if we continue to emphasize loving the city without taking into account gentrification, without sincerely and seriously wondering, how do we love our neighbors who were there before us? We will fail to love our neighbors, and we will fail to love the city. The truth is, and this isn't popular, we can't stop gentrification. It's too late. The truth is, white evangelicals, we can't fix gentrification, not by ourselves. It's too complex. What we can do is we can refuse to ignore it. We can address it in our churches. We can love our neighbors, and we can receive love from our neighbors, which leads me to the last thing I want to say to my white evangelical brothers and sisters. This is the way that we're applying the parable to this point, but this isn't the only way that this parable applies. It may not even be the primary way. Who was Jesus talking to in this parable? He was talking to a Jewish expert in the law. And so he introduces characters that he will identify with, right? So who are the characters he's supposed to identify with? Well, you have the Jewish priest and you have the Levite. Okay, so that's what led us to take the application that we just took. But there's another Jewish character in there that we didn't even address. The victim, lying powerless, covered in dirt, and in desperate need. And just like this Jewish victim needed an outsider to come and help him up from his filthy position, we white evangelicals need our black and brown brothers and sisters to come and pick us up out of the same dirt. Because while we are in a position of power socially, we are in a position of weakness spiritually and experientially on the issue of race. We can't even see that we're laying in a road covered in dirt and powerless to change. We need not just to love our neighbors, we desperately need our neighbors to love us so that we can see what they see. We also need to recognize, my white evangelical brothers and sisters, that we come into this world powerless. We come into this world with spiritual need. We come into this world spiritually weak. Remember with me, my white evangelical brothers and sisters, that you too were once vulnerable. You too were once oppressed by a system and by forces that were beyond your control. You too were once displaced from the home you were intended to have when you were cast out from the Eden of God. You too were separated from the community you had with God's people when you were cast out from the paradise of God. And what did Jesus do? He became your neighbor. He didn't live where you live. He didn't look like you look. He wasn't of the same status of you, not even close. And yet he nonetheless had mercy on you. He laid aside his immense and eternal power to take upon your vulnerability. He left his eternal home with God and took on your spiritual homelessness. And he did all of this so you could be freed from oppression, so you could be freed from evil forces and systems and given a real home, a lasting home, in perfect community with God, in perfect community with God's people. You didn't ask for that. You didn't deserve that. Jesus chose to be that kind of neighbor to you. And because he's been that kind of neighbor to you, you have the reason and the power to be that kind of neighbor to somebody else. That's good news. So now I get to talk to my black and brown brothers and sisters. If that's what the Bible says to the gentrifier, what does it say to those who are gentrified? What does it say to those of you who've been displaced or whose loved ones has been displaced? One way it speaks to you is in Jeremiah 29. That's the passage we just looked at together. You remember? It's been used by those coming into the city, but it's not for those coming into the city. It's for those who are being displaced. It's for you. Remember, in Jeremiah 29, God is speaking directly to those who've been displaced from their homes, directly to those who've been separated from their families, directly from those who've been disconnected from their places of worship. In other words, he's speaking directly to you. And in this passage, he essentially tells you to do two things. Number one, make a home wherever you land. And number two, seek the good of the very city that displaced you. Let's run through that. Number one, make a home wherever you land. Guys, Babylon didn't feel like home to the Israelites. It wasn't just a cataclysmic geographical change. It was a cataclysmic cultural change. It was on top of that a cataclysmic religious change. Nothing in Babylon was like it was in Jerusalem. It wasn't home. And yet what did God say to his people? Make it home. That's what he says in verses 5 and 6. Listen again. Build houses, settle down. Plant gardens, eat what they produced, marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. If you've been displaced, You can identify with Israel, right? You've experienced that cataclysmic geographical change. You've experienced that cataclysmic cultural change. The new place you live in, quite honestly, it doesn't feel like home. None of it. And yet God tells you to make it home, to establish yourself there, even if you don't want to be there, just like Israel had to do where they didn't want to be. Get to know your neighbors, become familiar with the churches, get involved in local schools. Whatever it means for you to make your new neighborhood home, make it home, because it is in making it home that the light of Christ and the truth of Christ that lives in you will flow into the neighborhood you're now a part of. Make it home. The second thing he says is seek the good of the very city that displaced you. That's what verse 6 says. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city. Pray to the Lord for it. That's crazy. Babylon cared more about its personal power and profit than it cared about the lives of real human beings. And yet God says, seek the peace and prosperity and pray for it. Your city cared more about its personal power and profit than it cared about you and your family and your community as human beings. And yet God says to you, seek its peace and prosperity and pray for it. Babylon didn't deserve that. Your city doesn't deserve that. But your God deserves that. So if you can't bring it to yourself to love the city that displaced you, bring it in yourself to love the God who loves the city that displaced you. And that might mean that by obeying the God you love, you're going to be angry at the injustice of the city as you should be, but you will not be bitter with the people of the city. Instead, you will seek their good even though they never sought yours. Obeying the God you love will mean even as you feel ignored by the new residents coming in, you won't ignore them. You will pray for them and sincerely desire their prosperity. Obeying the God you love will mean, yes, I'm grieved by the lack of empathy my white evangelical brothers and sisters have for my situation, but nonetheless, you will be patient with them. You'll remember that by the very virtue of them being born white in America, they are literally incapable of experiencing what you're experiencing. Incapable of seeing what you see apart from your patient bearing with and helping them see. I'm going to confess that all of that I just said is really hard. I'm going to confess that it's hard. It absolutely has to be hard for you because it's hard for me. And I'm white, like really, really white, with all the privilege that whiteness affords. And yet, I have lived basically my entire life in the area of Portland that has recently been gentrified. I've watched friends, family members, neighbors, and church members be displaced. I've watched white businesses, white people, and worst of all, white evangelicals come into the city without a hint of concern about the people who were there before them. And to be honest with you, it has filled me with anger. A potentially righteous anger, but an anger that I've allowed to control me and become a deep and abiding bitterness. So much so, this is confession time, that I honestly can't think of my own city without cursing it. There are honestly streets in this city that I intentionally avoid going down. There are honestly churches in this city that I intentionally avoid visiting precisely because of the bitter taste it puts in my mouth and the bitterness I allow to rule in my heart when I'm reminded of that. I feel that, guys, as a white man with white privilege who has never been displaced. I can't imagine how hard it is for you who are in a different position. I can't imagine how hard it is to seek the good of the city that displaced you, to truly and genuinely desire a city that didn't love you to prosper when it treated you as a commodity and as less than a human being. But this is what the God who loves you calls you to do. And just as I told my white evangelical brothers and sisters that the gospel gives them reason and power to do what God calls them to do, it also gives you reason and power to do what God calls you to do. The gospel reminds you that Jesus Christ, the only truly innocent being in all of history, was treated as guilty. The God who creates and sustains every human being was treated like he were less than the lowest of the low human beings. The human orchestrators of this treatment of God the Son, who? The government that's intended to protect him and the religion that was intended to be with him. Together, his own religion, together, his own government, dragged Jesus where? Out of the city. They dragged him out of the city he had called his home and to a hill of reproach. And there, outside the city, on that hill of reproach, as he prayed, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do," they murdered God. My brothers and sisters, this means that Jesus Christ can empathize with you. If you're feeling betrayed by your government, failed by your city, failed by your own religious brothers and sisters, Jesus has been there. He understands it, and he suffers with you. But it also means that you have something much better than the city you've been displaced from. Jesus Christ was literally dragged outside of the city so that you could be literally carried into the city of God. Jesus was rejected by the government and by people so that you could be forever accepted by God as his own son. Jesus was treated as less than a human being so you could be treated as if you were God the Son. All of this was given to you when you were unenlightened. All of this was given to you when you were living for no one but yourself, when you deserved nothing but judgment. And because of that, you have reason and power to love those who at this time do not deserve your love. So, to conclude, we've looked at history of gentrification. We looked at its effects. We've looked at how the Bible calls us to live. And I hope that we can see gentrification isn't just a city planning issue. It's not just an economic issue. It's a gospel issue. So I'd like to close by reading a passage. It's Hebrews 13, verses 12 through 14, which I think puts all of the cities of the earth in their proper perspective. Here's what it says. "And so Jesus also suffered outside the city gate to make the people holy through his own blood. Let us then go to him outside the camp, bearing the disgrace he bore. For here we do not have an enduring city, but we are looking for the city that is to come." Father, we thank you that you care about our suffering, and you have suffered our suffering. We thank you even more that you have given us a new city, an eternal city, where there be no division between black and white, rich and poor, this politic or that politic, but instead we will eternally abide together as family, together united around your throne and in your Son. May we live today as if that is true. Amen.